Daniel Brooks wasn't just my high school crush, he was my first love. We started dating in our second year, and for a while, I thought I was the luckiest girl in the world. He was charming, handsome, and came from one of the wealthiest families in the city. People always whispered about how someone like me had managed to date someone like him. What they didn't know was that my family wasn't poor. My father was a well-respected doctor, and my mother ran her own business. We weren't billionaires like the Brooks family, but we lived comfortably. Yet, because we didn't live in a mansion or drive the latest luxury cars, people assumed I was just some nobody who got lucky. Daniel never corrected them. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were young and in love, or so I thought. I envisioned a future with him, marriage, kids, a life built together. I stayed by his side through everything, supported him emotionally, helped him through exams, even comforted him when his father was being too harsh. I gave him my heart, and then he shattered it. We had been dating for almost 5 years, well into our early 20s, when I started talking about settling down. Nothing major, just a conversation about the future, maybe moving in together. I thought we were on the same page. I was wrong. One evening, we were out at a fancy restaurant, celebrating his latest business achievement. I had been nervous about bringing up the topic, but I finally gathered my courage. "Daniel, have you ever thought about what comes next for us?" I asked, reaching for his hand. He smirked, sipping his wine. "Next? What do you mean?" "Marriage," I said softly. "Building a life together." He stared at me for a moment, then did something I never expected. He laughed. Not just a chuckle, but full-blown laughter, as if I had told the funniest joke in the world. Heads turned toward us, people whispering. Embarrassment burned through me, but I waited for him to explain. "You actually think I would marry you?" He scoffed, shaking his head. I froze. "What do you mean? We've been together for years." I thought. "You thought wrong." He cut me off, leaning back in his seat. "Look, you're great for fun. You're sweet, you make me laugh, and I won't lie, you were a good distraction. But settling down? Marrying you? God, no." Tears welled in my eyes. "But why?" His lips curled into a cruel smirk. "Because you're not on my level. You come from a well-off family, sure, but you're still miles away from what I need. I want a wife who can elevate my status, not drag it down. Someone from real wealth. Not a doctor's daughter." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "So, all these years? I meant nothing to you." He sighed dramatically, as if my emotions were an inconvenience. "You were good for the time being. But I need a woman who fits my lifestyle, not someone who thinks hard work is the key to success. Money, sweetheart, that's what matters. And you just don't have enough of it." The final blow came when he pulled out his wallet and tossed a few $100 bills on the table. "Here," he said, smirking. "For your trouble. Consider it a breakup bonus." I stared at the money, my heart pounding. That was the moment something inside me broke. When Daniel humiliated me that night, something inside me snapped. I walked out of that restaurant with nothing but burning determination. I wouldn't cry over him. I wouldn't beg. I would make him regret it. I threw myself into my work, taking over my father's medical business and expanding it. I studied investments, ventured into real estate, and built my own wealth from the ground up. In a few years, I wasn't just successful, I was powerful. But power alone wasn't enough. I wanted Daniel to suffer. For years, I kept an eye on him from a distance. He was thriving, just as arrogant as ever, flaunting his money and jumping from one heiress to another. He was still the golden boy of high society, still the son of one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. Then, one day, an opportunity presented itself. Victor Brooks. He was everything his son wasn't. He was a ruthless businessman, but a refined man. Unlike Daniel, who was spoiled and reckless, Victor was sharp, calculated, and respected. He had built his empire with his own hands, and while his son spent money, Victor made it. I first saw him at an exclusive charity gala. He was standing alone near the balcony, watching the room like a king surveying his kingdom. His presence was commanding, his tailored black suit fitting him like it was made for him. A man like him didn't waste time on foolish things, which made him my perfect mark. If I wanted to destroy Daniel, I needed to become his stepmother. It wouldn't be easy. Victor was surrounded by models, socialites, and women who threw themselves at him. I had to be different. So I made a plan. 1. Make him notice me, but not by chasing him like the others. I needed to stand out. 2. Appeal to his mind, not just his desires. Victor respected intelligence. I would become someone he couldn't ignore. 3. Make him fall in love, and not just in a fleeting way. He had to adore me, trust me, and marry me. That night, I made my first move. I didn't approach him immediately. Instead, I positioned myself where he could see me but not reach me. I wore a sleek, black gown, elegant but not flashy. When our eyes met across the room, I didn't smile or bat my lashes like the others. I simply held his gaze for a second longer than necessary before turning away. It worked. Minutes later, Victor approached. "I don't believe we've met," he said, his deep voice smooth as silk. I turned, feigning surprise. "Victor Brooks. Everyone knows you. And you are?" I let a small, mysterious smile play on my lips. "Someone worth knowing." I saw a spark of intrigue in his eyes. Hook, line, sinker. I knew better than to give in too easily. Victor Brooks was a hunter. He liked the thrill of the chase. So I played the game. I let him pursue me. I refused his first dinner invitation, claiming I was too busy. The second time I agreed, but only for coffee. I made him earn my time. We talked about business, investments, and industry secrets. He quickly realized I wasn't just another pretty face. I was a woman with power and intelligence. And Victor loved power. Over time, he started calling me for advice, inviting me to events, introducing me to his inner circle. He respected me, trusted me, and, most importantly, he wanted me. The moment I knew I had one was at a private dinner in his penthouse. "I don't let people get close to me easily," he admitted over a glass of whiskey. "But you're different." I tilted my head, pretending to be amused. "Am I?" "You challenge me. You're not impressed by wealth or power. You have your own. That's rare." That night, he kissed me for the first time. A few months later, he proposed. And just like that, the plan to become Daniel Brooks' stepmother was achieved. The wedding was intimate but grand, just as Victor liked it. The press speculated, whispered about how the powerful and untouchable Victor Brooks had suddenly fallen in love and remarried. They wondered who I was, where I had come from, and how I had managed to capture the heart of one of the most influential men in the country. I let them talk. Because none of them knew the truth. None of them knew that as I stood there, exchanging vows with Victor, the only thing on my mind was the look that would be on Daniel's face when he finally found out. But I wasn't going to reveal myself so soon. No, this was a slow game, and I would play my role perfectly. I was now Mrs. Brooks, Daniel's stepmother. And my revenge had only just begun. Daniel was not present at the wedding. He had been out of the country on a business trip, one I had ensured lasted longer than expected. By the time he returned, the honeymoon was over, and I had already settled into my new life as Victor's wife. The first time we saw each other again was at a family dinner Victor had arranged. I arrived at the Brooks mansion early, wearing a cream-colored silk dress that clung to my body just enough to be elegant but tempting. My makeup was soft, my demeanor calm and poised. Victor greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, his arm wrapping possessively around my waist as he led me inside. Then, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. "Dad," Daniel's voice cut off mid-sentence as he stepped into the dining room. He froze. I turned to him slowly, letting the realization sink in. His breath hitched, his eyes widening in shock as he took me in. "You." His voice was hoarse. "What the hell are you doing here?" I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "Daniel, sweetheart, is that any way to greet your new stepmother?" Silence. Utter, deafening silence. Victor chuckled, oblivious to the storm raging in his son's mind. "Daniel, don't be rude. Come, have a seat." Daniel didn't move. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as his gaze flickered between me and his father. "This is a joke," he finally spat, voice laced with disbelief. Tell me this is a joke. Victor sighed. I know it's surprising, son, but I assure you, this is real. We're married. He smiled down at me, pride in his eyes. I wanted to tell you sooner, but with your trip. You married her? Daniel interrupted, his voice nearly shaking. I reached out, placing my hand over Victor's. I know this must be shocking for you, dear, but I hope we can be a family. I smiled sweetly, watching the horror spread across Daniel's face. His lips parted, but no words came out. Checkmate. Daniel didn't take it well. In the following weeks, he tried to avoid me, but that was impossible. I was now a part of his world at every event, every dinner, and every decision his father made. And I made sure he felt my presence. At family gatherings, I would sit beside Victor, running my fingers along his arm, whispering in his ear while Daniel seethed from across the table. At business meetings, I was always there, offering my opinions, swaying Victor's decisions, making sure Daniel knew I had influence where he no longer did. Everything I did was to remind him I was here to stay. And it was driving him insane. One evening, after another tense dinner, Daniel cornered me in the hallway. What the hell are you playing at? He hissed, his breath hot against my skin as he towered over me. I smirked. Whatever do you mean, Daniel? His hands balled into fists. You think this is funny? Marrying my father? Moving into my home? Acting like you belong here? I stepped closer, lifting a hand to brush imaginary lint off his jacket. He stiffened at the touch. I don't think, sweetheart. I know. His eyes darkened. You planned this, didn't you? I leaned in, my lips mere inches from his ear. Oh, Daniel, what makes you think you were ever in control? His breath hitched. I pulled back, smiling sweetly. Now, if you'll excuse me, your father is waiting for me in bed. And with that, I walked away, leaving him standing there, furious, helpless, and exactly where I wanted him. One evening, when Victor was away on business, Daniel finally snapped. I was in the library, pretending to read, when he stormed in, slamming the doors shut behind him. Enough, he growled. I barely glanced up. Is something wrong, dear stepson? Drop the act, he spat. I know what you're doing. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. And what exactly am I doing? His jaw clenched. You married my father for revenge. Finally, I set my book down and met his gaze. Did I? His nostrils flared. You think you can take everything from me? My father, my company, my life? You think I won't fight back? I smiled slowly, standing up and closing the distance between us. Fight back, then. His breath caught, just for a second. What do you want? He demanded. Money? Power? A divorce settlement that will make you rich? I leaned in, letting my lips hover near his ear. You don't get it, do you? It's not about the money, Daniel. He stiffened. I pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. It's about watching you suffer. For the first time, real fear flickered in his gaze. Because he finally understood. This wasn't just a game. This was war. For years, Daniel Brooks had been untouchable, privileged, powerful, and worshipped by those who wanted a taste of his wealth. He was the kind of man who believed the world revolved around him, who thought women were accessories to be discarded when they were no longer useful. And now? He was living under my rule. I didn't rush my revenge. No, I was patient. I wanted him to feel every inch of the walls closing in around him. At first, it was small changes. Victor began questioning Daniel's decisions more often, asking for my input instead. My suggestions, carefully calculated, always put Daniel in an unfavorable light. I didn't directly oppose him. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I let doubt fester in his father's mind. Daniel, I don't think you're considering all options. Perhaps we should listen to my wife on this. She has an excellent perspective. Daniel, maybe you should take some time off, clear your head. You've been too emotional lately. The board members, once loyal to him, began turning towards me. The moment he realized it, the rage in his eyes burned hotter than ever. I knew Daniel wanted to lash out at me, to expose me for the schemer I was, but I didn't give him the chance. In front of Victor, I played the devoted wife. I smiled sweetly, acted gracious, and lavished my husband with the kind of attention that made people envy him. Victor and I are so in sync. He understands me like no one else ever has. I'm just so lucky to have such a supportive husband. I never imagined I'd be this happy. Daniel had to sit through dinners, business meetings, and social gatherings, watching as I wrapped his father around my little finger. The worst part for him? Victor adored me more with each passing day. Daniel had a habit of dating beautiful, socialite women who looked good on his arm, but never lasted long enough to be anything meaningful. So, I ruined that for him. I made sure every woman he pursued mysteriously lost interest. The women who usually threw themselves at him suddenly looked at him with hesitation. It was subtle. But he noticed. "You're poisoning my life," he snarled one evening when Victor was away on business. I simply sipped my wine and smirked. "Oh, darling. I haven't even started yet." I was expecting Daniel to break eventually, but I didn't anticipate it happening the way it did. It was at a charity gala. One of those extravagant, high society events where everyone smiled through gritted teeth and pretended to be charitable. I had, of course, arranged for Daniel to be seated right next to me, ensuring he had to endure an entire evening of watching me charm the elite. Victor, as always, was proud of me. "My wife has a brilliant mind," he said, raising his glass in a toast. "I don't know what I'd do without her." The guests murmured their approval, some even looking at me with admiration. I could feel Daniel's fury simmering beside me. And then came the final blow. Victor placed a hand on my stomach, a proud smile on his face. "We have some wonderful news. We've decided it's time to expand our family." Silence. Then gasps. Daniel choked on his drink. "You're pregnant." I placed a hand over Victor's and patted it motherly, smiling sweetly. "We're trying." Daniel went pale. His fork clattered against his plate as he abruptly stood up, knocking his chair back. The entire table stared as he stormed out of the ballroom. I took a slow sip of my champagne. I had broken him, and I wasn't finished yet. Daniel had always believed he was untouchable. The golden heir. The man who had everything handed to him on a silver platter. But now, he was being forced to watch as I cemented my place in his family permanently. And I made sure he felt every second of it. Victor and I had agreed, we wanted a baby. And when Victor wanted something, he pursued it with relentless determination. I had been worried at first, worried that Daniel might find some way to convince his father to drop me before I secured my place. But once Victor decided something, there was no changing his mind. And now, our marriage bed had one goal, creating an heir. I made sure Daniel knew it too. I became shameless. Victor and I couldn't keep our hands off each other, not in private, and definitely not in places where Daniel could see us. At the breakfast table, I sat on Victor's lap, giggling as he kissed my neck. "Darling, you're insatiable." In the car, I whispered in his ear while Daniel sat stiffly in the front seat. "Maybe we should try again when we get home." At business meetings, I adjusted my dress, subtly hinting at what had happened before we arrived. "Sorry we're late." Victor and I got a little distracted. Daniel was always there, watching, seething, drowning in the realization that his father was giving me everything he had once laughed at me for wanting. It happened after another gala, when Victor had once again boasted to his business associates about our efforts to conceive. "We're taking every opportunity," he had said proudly. "It's been a lot of fun." I had kissed his cheek, playing the perfect, devoted wife. Daniel had clenched his jaw so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. Later that night, I stepped out onto the balcony for some air, still glowing from the night's victories. Daniel followed. "You're disgusting," he spat. I turned slowly, letting the moonlight illuminate my smirk. "Jealous. You're using my father." "And?" I interrupted smoothly, tilting my head. "What are you going to do about it?" He took a step closer, his fists clenched. His entire body radiated fury, frustration, and something else, something darker. "This won't last," he hissed. "My father will see through you." I leaned in, my lips brushing against his ear. "By the time he does, I'll be carrying his child." His breath hitched. I chuckled, stepping back. "Good night, Daniel." Then I walked away, knowing he would spend the rest of the night haunted by the image of what I was doing with his father. And I loved every second of it. I had won. I had spent months crafting my revenge, making Daniel suffer in every way possible. Every touch, every kiss, every moan I shared with his father had been a knife to his pride. And now I was carrying the final blow inside me. I had suspected for weeks. The nausea, the exhaustion, the sudden craving for things I had never liked before. Victor had noticed too, fussing over me like a devoted husband, insisting I see the doctor. "You've been looking a little pale, my love," he said one morning, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Let's get it checked out, just in case." I agreed, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted it confirmed. And I wanted Daniel to hear it from Victor himself. The doctor's office was a pristine, sterile space, but when the screen showed not one, but two tiny heartbeats, warmth spread through my entire body. "Twins," the doctor announced with a smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Brooks." I was too stunned to respond at first. Twins. Two little lives growing inside me. Victor's children. For the first time, my carefully built walls cracked. I wasn't just playing a game anymore. This wasn't just a power move. This was real. Victor kissed me deeply, whispering how happy he was, how this was the best news of his life. And for a moment, I forgot about Daniel, about revenge, about the past. I was just a woman, adored by her husband, carrying his children. But reality crashed back in when we returned home. Victor, too excited to wait, announced it during dinner. "We're having twins," he said, grinning proudly. "Isn't that wonderful?" Daniel dropped his fork. His entire body went rigid, his face paling as his gaze snapped to me. "Twins," he echoed, his voice hollow. I smiled sweetly, resting a hand on my stomach. "Yes, looks like your father and I have been very productive." Daniel pushed his chair back so violently it screeched against the floor. He stormed out without another word. Victor barely noticed, too busy celebrating. But I noticed, and I relished it. As the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. I had expected Victor to dote on me. He was already an attentive husband. But I hadn't expected to enjoy it as much as I did. I had married him for revenge, for security, to ruin his son's life. But as he carried me to bed when I was too tired, as he pressed soft kisses to my stomach every morning, as he whispered sweet nothings into my ear, I realized. I adored this man. The silver fox with his sharp mind, his protective nature, and the way he worshipped me. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped pretending. I had fallen for him. And nothing, not even Daniel's hatred, could change that. I had thought revenge would be my greatest victory. That making Daniel suffer would be the most satisfying moment of my life. But as I stood in my nursery, watching my husband, my Victor, hold our twin daughters in his arms, I realized something. The sweetest revenge wasn't ruining Daniel. It was realizing that I no longer cared about him at all. Daniel had been unraveling for months. At first, it was subtle, tight smiles, clenched fists, lingering stares whenever Victor kissed my swollen belly. But the night I gave birth? That was the night he truly broke. He hadn't been allowed into the delivery room, of course. That privilege was reserved for Victor, who had held my hand the entire time, whispering encouragements, pressing kisses to my forehead as I brought our daughters into the world. When he carried them out to introduce them to the rest of the family, Daniel had been there. And when he heard their names, Celeste and Victoria Brooks, something in him snapped. "You named them after Dad and yourself?" His voice was hoarse, his eyes wide with disbelief. Victor grinned. "Of course. They're our legacy." I turned away from the nursery to see Daniel standing behind me. He looked at me, something desperate in his expression. "This was all a game to you, wasn't it?" His voice was low, shaking. "You never loved him." I stepped closer, tilting my head. "You're wrong." His breath hitched. I smiled, softer this time. "I did want revenge, Daniel. But somewhere along the way, I fell in love with your father." Daniel's face twisted in anger as he took a step closer. "I'll tell him everything," he spat. "That we were together before you married him." Before I could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "No need." Victor's calm, measured tone sent a chill through the air. He stepped out of the nursery, his arms crossed, eyes assessing the scene before him. He looked utterly unbothered, as if this conversation was nothing more than an expected inconvenience. "I already knew," he said simply. Silence stretched between us. Daniel's body went rigid, his expression frozen in disbelief. Next to him, I remained still, a quiet satisfaction curling in my chest. "You think I married her without knowing who she was to you?" Victor's tone was almost amused, his gaze flickering between us. I knew from the start. Daniel's shock was unmistakable, his face paled, his mouth parting slightly. Victor took a slow step forward, never breaking eye contact with his son. "At first, I wanted to teach you a lesson," he admitted, voice even unreadable. "Watching you stumble through life, wasting every opportunity, playing with hearts like they're disposable. I thought it was time you learned what it feels like." Then, his gaze shifted, settling on me. And for the first time in this conversation, something softened in his expression. But then I fell. Victor's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Daniel still looked stunned, his hands clenched at his sides. "You knew, and you didn't care?" Victor let out a quiet chuckle. "Not in the way you think. I suspected her motives from the beginning, but I wanted to see for myself what she was about, what she was capable of." He turned to me then, his gaze unwavering. And I wasn't disappointed. Warmth spread through my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. There was no betrayal in his words, no malice, just truth. Daniel looked like he had been punched in the gut. Like he had just lost the most important game of his life. And he had. I had taken everything from him. His confidence. His peace. His family's legacy. And worst of all, I didn't care about him anymore. "Goodbye, Daniel," I whispered. "I hope you enjoy watching me live the life you never thought I deserved." Daniel had humiliated me once. But now, I was the one who had everything. And he was left with nothing.